It was a quiet March morning in 2014 when 5-year-old Zaniah Jackson climbed into the back seat of her mother's red car, buckling her seatbelt as the engine purred to life. That day, her mother, Crystal Jackson, and her close friend and partner, Britney Cosby, planned to take Zaniah to school before heading out for errands. Police would later piece together that the trio left the Jackson family home near Houston at their usual time, but they never arrived at Zaniah's school. Instead, an hour later, a frantic 911 call came in from a nearby convenience store. The clerk's voice shook as he reported finding 2 bodies behind the dumpster. A young woman and her girlfriend, each beaten and lifeless. Zaniah was missing. News of Crystal's disappearance rippled through the Jackson family. In the next neighborhood over, Reverend Ivan Jackson, Crystal's father, sat at his kitchen table as a deputy delivered the grim news. His wife, Mary, covered her mouth in shock as a deputy explained that an unidentified assailant had brutally attacked Crystal and her partner. Reverend Jackson's heart pounded as he thought of little Zaniah alone somewhere, her tiny voice silenced by terror. He rushed home, praying that his granddaughter had somehow escaped harm, clinging to the hope that someone had simply forgotten to call him. But that hope dissolved when paramedics confirmed they had found only 2 bodies, their daughter and her partner, in a pool of blood behind that convenience store. Minutes after the initial 911 call, television screens across Texas lit up with the breaking news. Crystal Jackson and her girlfriend, Britney Cosby, had been found murdered on Bolivar Peninsula, a remote stretch near Galveston Bay. Reporters spoke of a hate crime. Both women were African American and in a same-sex relationship, a fact that many believed had made them targets. The name of little Zaniah did not appear on those broadcasts. Her fate remained unknown as search teams fanned out across the neighborhood, scouring backyards, alleyways, and abandoned buildings in hope of finding the frightened child. Meanwhile, Britney's family gathered in disbelief. Her Aunt Ebony McDade sat at home when Facebook messages flooded her phone. Friends and neighbors asking for any news, urging her to turn on the television. She clicked a live news feed where images of Britney's smiling face emerged beside the photo of Crystal, both surrounded by memorial candles. Ebony felt her world, tilt sister, niece, daughter, gone. Britney's father, James Cosby, barely had time to absorb the shock before detectives arrived at his doorstep, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. They led him into a small interview room at the sheriff's station and told him that his daughter and her partner were dead, their bodies found behind a store's dumpster. James sank into a chair, confusion and sorrow racking his body as he asked over and over what had happened. Detectives explained that foul play was suspected. Police needed any information he had about his daughter's last known movements. James could only remember that they had left with Zaniah that morning, as usual, and that it would be out of character for the 3 of them not to follow their routine. He assured officers that if he thought of anything, he would come forward, but even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their eyes. While detectives pursued every lead camera footage, neighbor statements, cell phone records, the Jackson family faced a private horror. Zaniah remained missing. Reverend Jackson and his wife sat in their living room, rocking back and forth, praying for their granddaughter's safety. Reverend Jackson remembered every day of Crystal's childhood, from her first steps to her bright laugh. He could not believe his daughter had been murdered, and worse, that her daughter might also be lost to them forever. Mary's arms wrapped around him as they awaited any word. Then, 15 hours after the murders, a call came from the local fire chief at Bolivar Peninsula. He had led the rescue effort and had just found a little girl wandering, alone, a few blocks from where the bodies lay. He was bringing her to safety. Reverend Jackson felt a wave of relief that nearly knocked him off his feet. His granddaughter was alive. Zaniah was reunited with her grandparents that afternoon. She was wrapped in a warm blanket, her eyes wide and frightened as she clung to Reverend Jackson. He held her tight, tears streaming down his face, as the deputy explained that she had been found wrapped in a pink jacket, but alone with no visible injuries. She had no memory of where her mother and Britney had gone, only that they had hugged her and told her to stay put in the car. She had heard strange noises inside the house when her mother and Britney stepped out, but she waited in the car, hands clasped tight, until an older neighbor found her and led her out of the vehicle. Zaniah's simple statement, I heard a boom and a BZZT, like someone lasering someone. Become a unseen clue. One that baffled detectives and tugged at Zaniah's fragile mind. Investigators began pursuing multiple theories. They found evidence of a violent struggle inside the Jackson home, upturned chairs, shattered picture frames, and spots of blood on the living room carpet. But outside, behind the convenience store, the bodies showed no clear pattern of robbery or forced entry. Autopsy reports revealed that Crystal had died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head, while Britney had suffered multiple blows to the skull, the force so great it fractured her facial bones. The brutality suggested a personal motive, an act carried out in anger or hate, not a random attack. Police initially considered Reverend Jackson's strong opposition to his daughter's relationship. In recorded interviews, he had expressed deep hurt over Crystal's sexuality, warning her that such a lifestyle would lead to danger. Detectives wondered whether his words, "I told my daughter that lesbian stuff would be the cause of her death," had turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. When police first brought Reverend Jackson in for questioning, he was composed but sorrowful. He told officers he had loved his daughter dearly, though he had struggled to accept her identity. He admitted to owning the .25 caliber handgun his daughter had accidentally discovered under his bed a few days before. He had taken it for safety, fearing crime in their neighborhood, but he insisted he would never harm his own child. He said he had never left that gun in the house when Krista and Britney arrived with Zaniah that morning. Despite his cooperation, police noted his hesitance when asked about certain details: what time he had woken, how the gun had disappeared, why he had been so insistent on telling Crystal to end the relationship. But lacking direct evidence, detectives temporarily set aside Reverend Jackson as a suspect. Attention then turned to the only other adult confirmed to have been at the scene that morning: Britney's father, James Cosby. James had dropped Crystal, Britney, and Zaniah at the Jackson home the night before, then returned home alone. On the morning of the murders, he said he went about his usual routine, a quick shopping trip, then a call with friends. When detectives questioned him at the murder scene, he appeared shocked and sincere, asking repeatedly if anyone was hurt. He stated that he had not returned to the house that morning and had no idea what had happened. Yet detectives found that he had a key to the Jackson home, a key no one else claimed to possess except Reverend Jackson. They wondered if James could have entered the house, committed the crimes, then planted Zaniah in the car to claim she had seen a stranger. The turning point came when officers searched James' rented garage. They found a small pile of used bricks near the back wall, just as his cousin, caretaker Cora Ledette, had remarked. That brick pile had been there for years. But on that day, 4 small drops of fresh blood dotted the concrete floor and splattered onto the bricks themselves. The drops matched the same deep red hue found at the convenience store scene. Detectives called crime scene technicians, who photographed the evidence under UV light and collected the bricks for fingerprint and DNA analysis. The results were damning. A match to James Cosby's prints in his garage. Among the bricks lay the bloody proof that he had returned to the Jackson home after dropping off his daughter and her mother, and had staged a violent altercation that left Cristo and Britney dead. When detectives confronted James in an interrogation room at the sheriff's office, they laid out the evidence: the fingerprint-covered bricks, the timeline that placed him at the scene, the distinct bullet casings found in his garage matching the caliber that killed Crystal. His face remained impassive as they asked him to explain. Time after time, he insisted he had no idea how blood had gotten into his garage, that he had never returned that morning after the drop-off. Yet Lieutenant Hanson's patience wore thin. As he pressed James to break down, he slammed his hand on the table and demanded an explanation. Whose blood was that in the garage, if not his daughter S or her mother S? James refused to answer. Detectives placed him under arrest for tampering with evidence and detained him for questioning on the murders. Back at the Jackson home, Reverend Jackson and Mary wrapped their arms around little Zaniah, who sat quietly clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide with fear. They explained that her father had gone to jail, that the police had found the person who hurt her mother and Britney. 5-year-old Zaniah might not have grasped all the details, but she remembered every sound, every fleeting shadow she had seen that morning. In her own words, she knew it had not been a stranger, but someone she recognized, someone tall, someone she had glimpsed through the threshold of the garage. As charges were filed and the legal wheels began to turn, The community rallied around the little girl who had so bravely told what she knew. Donations poured in to help cover funeral and legal costs. Religious leaders held interfaith vigils, calling for justice and for the safety of children everywhere. Zaniah became the youngest witness in Harris County to identify a suspect in a murder investigation, a witness whose simple, clear recollection had cracked open a case that might otherwise have gone cold. But for the Jackson family, relief was tempered by sorrow. There were still questions of motive. Had someone in the lives of Crystal and Britney chosen violence over love? And there was the trauma Zaniah would carry forever. The memory of seeing her mother's head bashed in and watching her family torn apart. In the weeks ahead, detectives would gather more evidence, ballistic tests on the bullet that killed Crystal, cell tower pings that placed James' phone at the scene, and testimony from neighbors who had heard Ray's voices the night before. Yet it was that small, brave voice of a 5-year-old that had set the course for justice. Detective Kitchens and his partner, Sergeant Kilburn, packed up their notes and evidence late one evening after arresting James Cosby for tampering with evidence. They knew that securing a confession or witness testimony would be essential to charge him with murder. The next morning, Kitchens sat down with his lieutenant to review every piece of the case file. Zaniah's recorded statements, the blood-spattered bricks from Cosby's garage, the fingerprint match, and the autopsy reports detailing how Crystal Jackson's skull had been fractured by a single, precise blow, and how Britney Cosby had suffered multiple forceful, blunt impacts to her face. Each item formed a puzzle piece that pointed inexorably to Cosby. Yet Kitchens understood that going from an evidence tampering charge to 2 counts of capital murder required a watertight case. Over the coming weeks, Kitchens revisited the Jackson residence to re-interview Annie Lee Cosby, Britney's great-grandmother, who had been caring for young Zaniah after the murders. He wanted to confirm the timeline of that morning. How Annie Lee last saw the 3 of them. How they arrived at Reverend Jackson's house, and the moment she heard the fatal argument inside, she described how Crystal had stepped out with a worried look, as if to calm James, then how the argument's muffled shouts had abruptly stopped. Kitchens cross-referenced her account with Zaniah's and found them in near-perfect alignment. Zaniah had heard the boom of the fatal blow and the BZZT of Crystal's final gasp. Kitchens felt a chill as he realized the little girl's clarity was a keystone her. Simple, childlike descriptions carrying more truth than an adult's would have. At the coroner's office, Kitchens and Kilburn watched as Dr. Mark Rosenberg, the county medical examiner, demonstrated the nature of the blows that killed the 2 women. He used a human skull replica and a prop hammer to show how a single, concentrated strike with a heavy object, likely a metal brick or block, could produce the exact fracture pattern seen in Crystal's remains. He pointed out that the greater number of blows on Britney's face indicated rage and overkill, supporting the theory that Cosby's actions were personal and driven by jealousy or anger. Kitchens took meticulous notes. Dr. Rosenberg's testimony would prove critical in court, demonstrating not only that the blows were deliberate, but also that they fit with evidence found at Cosby's garage. Back at headquarters, Kitchens and Kilburn brought in the CCTV footage from near the Jackson home, which had been looped on a local store's security system. Although grainy and captured from a distance, the video showed the red car entering the driveway that morning. Then later, the same car idling outside a convenience store, while a lone figure approached the dumpster. By enlarging frames and adjusting contrast, they matched the gait and build of the figure to Cosby's height and body type. The detectives had a still frame of Cosby stepping out of the driver's seat before opening the trunk. Kitchens sent the footage to the county's crime lab specialists, who overlaid it with a photograph of Cosby's build and confirmed the match to within millimeters. This link placed Cosby at the exact spot where the bodies had been found, reinforcing the theory that he had driven the victim's own car to that remote location after committing the murders. With these pieces in place in Zaniah's testimony, the bricks and fingerprints in Cosby's garage, the CCTV evidence, and the coroner's analysis, Kitchens prepared the probable cause affidavit for the homicide charges. He wrote that the totality of evidence establishes beyond reason that James L. Cosby Jr. deliberately assaulted Britney Cosby with a heavy object and fired a firearm at Crystal Jackson, resulting in their deaths. The affidavit requested 2 counts of capital murder. Kitchens anticipated Cosby's attorneys would attempt to suppress the child, statements and the brick evidence as improperly obtained. To preempt that, Kitchens reviewed every step of the collection process, ensuring that each item had been documented with chain of custody forms and that no rights had been violated. To Cosby's arrest or the garage search. On April 17, 2014, Detective Kitchens and Deputy District Attorney Marissa Grant presented the evidence to a grand jury. The courtroom clerk administered oaths, and Kitchens walked through each exhibit. He played Zaniah's recorded interview, explaining how a child-esque, clear recollection of the sounds and sights in her own living room where no stranger had gained entry carried the weight of direct observation. He testified to the bricks and blood in the garage, the blood type and the CCTV, all pointing exclusively to Cosby's culpability. The jurors listened intently, flipping through photos of the carpet, the destroyed front bedroom, and the two piles of bodies behind the convenience store dumpster. They saw the impact site on Crystala's skull and the pattern of facial fractures on Britney's skeletal remains. Some jurors wiped away tears. Others took deep breaths as they digested the brutality of the crime. After 2 hours of testimony by Kitchens and the crime lab specialists, D.A. Grant summarized the state's case. We have a motive of jealousy and financial gain. The forensic evidence linking the defendant to the crime scene, the direct eyewitness account of the victim's small child, and ballistic evidence tying the fatal bullet to a .25 caliber weapon belonging to the defendantor. A bullet identical in make and model. We ask you to return bills of indictment charging James L. Cosby Jr. with 2 counts of capital murder. The foreperson nodded, and after a brief recess, returned with 2 indictments. Cosby would now stand trial for murder in the deaths of Britney Cosby and Crystal Jackson. The formal arraignment took place days later. Cosby entered a plea of not guilty. His attorney, Samuel Price, moved to suppress Zaniah's statements, arguing that a 5-year-old could not reliably identify a murderer and that her interview was conducted without his client's attorney present. Kitchens and Grant braced for a lengthy suppression hearing but were ready. They provided detailed logs showing how Zaniah's interview had been conducted with only a guardian present, pursuant to a waiver signed by her grandmother and under the supervision of a child welfare specialist. Moreover, they argued that the statements were voluntary and critical to the case because the child had no motive to lie. The judge, after reviewing the transcripts and hearing testimony from the officer who conducted the interview, ruled that Zaniah's statements would be admissible. Her age and familial relationship did not undermine her competence to recall sensory impressions she had directly experienced. Next, the defense attempted to suppress the brick evidence, contending that the officers had conducted an unauthorized search of Cosby's garage. They argued that the Detective S entry into the garage quoted as forcing open the door violated Cosby's Fourth Amendment rights. Kitchens prepared to testify. He explained that Cosby's car and the Jackson residence were both being treated as crime scenes, and that Cosby's garage, used in connection with the case, was subject to warrantless search under emergency exception C exceptions. Moreover, they had obtained a search warrant ex post facto before collecting the bricks, due to the discovery of blood droplets in plain view. The judge agreed, noting that the initial emergency circumstances justified immediate action, and that the subsequent warrant cured any potential defect. The bricks and fingerprint evidence remained in play. With evidentiary matters settled, trial preparation began in earnest. Kitchens worked with D.A. Grant to prepare witnesses. Zaniah's grandmother would testify about her granddaughter's condition at the interview, to preempt any defense suggestion that a traumatized child invented the stranger's explanation. Crime lab analysts would demonstrate fingerprint mapping and blood pattern analysis, and Dr. Rosenberg would be on call to testify about skull fractures. Kitchens himself rehearsed his direct testimony, remembering each detail of that morning's garage search. He knew the defense would try to spin the evidence painting Cosby as an overprotective father accidentally caught up in a crime scene. Kitchens resolved to stick to the facts. Brick by brick, droplet by droplet, the truth of Cosby's guilt would emerge. Meanwhile, in the Cosby residence, Annie Lee continued caring for Zaniah. The child would accompany Annie Lee to court sessions, wearing a small witness button and clutching a photograph of her mother and Britney. In counseling sessions arranged by the prosecutor's office, Zaniah spoke with child psychologists to ensure her testimony would not re-traumatize her. She practiced answering simple, factual questions. Who came into the house? Was it big or small? Did you see mommy after? Each rehearsal was gentle and paced. Respecting her age and emotional needs, Zaniah surprised many by recalling minor details. The color of her mother's sweater that morning, the sound of a door slamming inside the house, the way her mother's car door slammed shut when no one else entered or left. By the time jury selection began in late summer 2014, Kitchens and Grant felt confident. They had a strong narrative. A father, jealous and financially envious, who loomed over both women's lives. A little girl who saw him wield a heavy object and heard that fatal crack against her mother's skull. And a trail of blood leading from the Jackson home to Cosby's own garage. Interviews with co-workers of Britney and Crystal had uncovered subtle tensions over newly co-signed car payments and inheritance disputes with the Cosby family, establishing motive. Defense counsel's impossibility arguments now rang hollow against the weight of the physical evidence. On the first day of trial, the judge emphasized that the jury must base its verdict solely on the evidence presented. Kitchens watched from the gallery as 12 jurors were sworn in 6 men, 6 women, a cross-section of the community who would determine if a man's own child could unmask his darkest act. When opening statements began, Kitchens could feel the tension in the courtroom. The quiet sobs from family members, the reporters poised for every twist. Yet he understood that the trial's true power would not lie in his steady delivery or the prosecutor's rhetoric, but in the simple truth that a little girl's clear-eyed observations had set justice into motion. The courtroom was hushed as the final witnesses finished their testimony and the attorneys prepared for closing arguments. 12 jurors sat in the box, their notebooks filled with evidence. The surveillance footage of the red car arriving at the Jackson home, photographs of the blood-splattered bricks found in James Cosby's garage. Dr. Rosenberg's charts showing the precise angle and force of the blow that killed Crystal. The autopsy reports confirming Britney's multiple facial fractures. The fingerprint analysis tying Cosby to the bricks. And, above all, the clear recording of 5-year-old Zaniah's words, calmly describing hearing a boom and a BZZT, and seeing a tall man she recognized enter the house and commit the violence. In that tape, she had been able to tell detectives things no adult witness could. Who had attacked her mother, the sounds of the fatal strike, and the bloody scene in her own garage. Deputy District Attorney Marissa Grant rose first for the state's closing argument. She spoke in measured, empathetic tones, reminding jurors of what they had seen. 2 vibrant young women, one a mother, one a devoted partner murdered in cold blood. She urged the jury to remember Zaniah's bravery, how the child's voice had shattered the darkness that once shrouded the case, guiding investigators to the truth. Grant reviewed the motive. Jealousy, wounded pride, and the financial leverage James Cosby had sought when he tried to co-sign a car loan for Britney and Crystal only to be refused by Annie Lee. She had watched her daughter build a life with Crystal, and that life had threatened his control. He had snapped, transforming a routine morning drop-off into a scene of brutality. Grant's words were simple but powerful. This man killed his daughter and her partner. He forged a lie. He hid the evidence in his own home, and he tried to manipulate a child's memory. But under layers of denial and deceit, a 5-year-old girl's truth shone through. Defense attorney Samuel Price stood to present his argument. His voice was calm, almost paternal, as he acknowledged the loss felt by the families. He spoke of the traumatic nature of the crime, the grief that could cloud judgment, and the need for reasonable doubt. Price argued that there was no direct footage of Cosby committing the murders, that the CCTV only placed his vehicle near the convenience store, and that the bridging from tampering evidence to double homicide was suspect. He pointed to possible gaps in the chain of custody of the bricks. The time lag between the murders and the discovery of blood in Cosby's garage, and asked whether Zaniah's trauma could have led to confusion in her statements. Price urged jurors to remember that a child's fear and loyalty could shape her memory. He closed by asking the jury not to convict on passion or sympathy, but on incontrovertible proof that he contended was still missing. After both sides rested, the judge instructed the jurors on Texas law regarding capital murder, premeditation, and the requisite burden of proof. He explained that if they found that Cosby had intentionally killed Crystal and Britney, they could return verdicts of first-degree murder. The jurors filed out to deliberate. Inside the jury room, silence reigned as they reviewed exhibits. Sequences of still frames from the surveillance footage, mapped locations of blood droplets, and the transcript of Zaniah's interview. Each juror pondered the weight of a child's words against the technical arguments of defense counsel. Finally, after 6 hours of sober discussion, the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on both counts of capital murder. Back in the courtroom, there was a collective exhale. Cosby's face grew pale as the words sank in. His attorney moved for a new trial, arguing prejudice, but the judge denied the motion. In the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide between life, imprisonment, and the death penalty, photos of Britney and Cristo were displayed once more, alongside fatherly letters from Reverend Jackson and tearful statements from Annie Lee and Bonnie Bowles. The jurors, moved by the family's pleas and guided by Zaniah's unwavering testimony, opted for life without parole. In Texas, capital murder demanded either execution or permanent imprisonment. Cosby would spend his days behind bars, removed forever from the world he had so gravely harmed. In the months that followed, the families sought healing and meaning in the tragedy. Reverend Jackson and Mary formally adopted, raising her as their own and enrolling her in counseling to help her process the trauma she had witnessed. They held a private memorial on the anniversary of the murders, gathering close friends and church members to light candles and share stories of Cristo S. kindness and Britney S. infectious laughter. Zaniah, now 6, placed a single pink rose by candles bearing her mother's and Britney's names, her small hand trembling as she whispered a child's prayer for their souls. The community showed up in force, sending flowers, donations, and unwavering support to the little girl whose courage had brought justice. Britney's Aunt Ebony and friends established the Cosby Jackson Memorial Fund, offering scholarships to LGBTQ youth and grants to families coping with homophobic violence. The fund also provided counseling services for child witnesses in violent crimes, inspired by Zaniah's need for early psychological care. Reverend Jackson spoke at national conferences on child witness trauma, urging law enforcement agencies to record and preserve the testimony of minors, no matter how young, when those children have seen critical details. He credited Zaniah's clarity in breaking the case and called for training programs teaching officers how to interview children gently yet effectively. Meanwhile, Detective Kichitsu had become Zaniah's godfather in the family. ICE published a departmental handbook on forensic interviewing of child witnesses. His step-by-step guidelines emphasized building rapport, using age-appropriate language, and ensuring the child's well-being throughout the process. Police academies across Texas adopted the handbook, and law enforcement instructors praised his methods as revolutionary, raising conviction rates in cases where adult witnesses were scarce. But child witnesses held the key. On the legislative front, State Senator Jane Rodriguez introduced Zaniah's Law, a bill mandating specialized support and legal protocols for child witnesses under age 7. The law required creation of child advocacy centers in each county, staffed with forensic interviewers, child psychologists, and victim advocates. It also guaranteed that a child's recorded testimony, if at risk due to health or age, would be admissible in court under strict safeguards, without infringing on defendants' confrontation rights. Rodriguez credited Zaniah's story as the impetus. Her brave testimony, captured in that small interview room, had saved a community from impunity. The law sailed through the legislature with bipartisan support and was signed by the governor, marking a historic step in protecting the most vulnerable witnesses in the justice system. For Zaniah, life resumed in quiet, healing rhythms. She started first grade with her grandparents by her side, learning to read and write, her small voice filled with both wonder and the weight of early trauma. When reporters sought interviews, she politely declined, drawing a line between her private grief and the public attention she still received. In counseling, she learned to paint her feelings, smearing acrylics of pink and blue onto canvas to express the love she still felt for her mother and Britney, and the sadness that would never fully leave her. Christmas mornings found her placing handmade cards on a family memorial tree, each ornament engraved with a memory. Mom's hug, Crystal's laugh, car rides with Mama. Over the next decade, as Zaniah grew into an articulate teenager, her story continued to inspire. She spoke at child witness seminars, her voice steady as she recounted the importance of telling the truth, of trusting one's own eyes and ears. She joined youth groups advocating for LGBTQ equality, honoring Britney and Crystal's partnership and extending their legacy of love. School counselors noted her empathy for other students facing grief, and she volunteered with court-appointed special advocates for children in need. In interviews, she never forgot to credit her mother and Britney for giving her the life she now fought to protect in others. In the annals of Texas criminal justice, the Cosby-Jackson case became a landmark. The rare instance where a child SI solved a double homicide, where a 5-year-old's memory shattered the defense's assumption of confusion. Manuals on homicide investigation cited the case as proof that age does not equal unreliability. And prosecutors used Zaniah's testimony as a model for presenting child witnesses. Community centers across the state held annual Zaniah Day events, storytelling, and safety workshops for children, ensuring that the community never forgot how a brave girl's voice could bring truth to light. As part of the 20th anniversary of the murders, the community erected a memorial bench outside the courthouse, inscribed with the names of Crystal Jackson and Britney Cosby. And a quote from Zaniah: "I saw what happened. Mommy and Miss Cosby didn't deserve that. I told the truth." Reverend Jackson and Bonnie held hands as they placed a rose upon the bench, while Zaniah, now 15, stood tall beside them, her eyes shining with both sorrow and pride. She had carried the weight of her mother's death in Britney's life, but she had also carried their legacy forward with grace beyond her years. In that moment, surrounded by family and friends, Zaniah understood that her early trauma had not defined her. Her courage had. The man responsible for tearing her world apart lay in a prison cell, serving a life sentence with no chance of parole. Justice had been done, and the laws had changed because of her witness. Yet the greatest testament to her mother's love and Britney's devotion lay in the woman Zaniah had become: resilient, compassionate, and determined to give voice to those who could not speak. And in that truth, the memory of Britney Cosby and Crystal Jackson lived on, never forgotten, forever honored. And always a reminder that even the smallest voice can be the loudest call for justice. Thanks for joining us in this journey. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories. Stay tuned.